Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Jessica, and today we will be covering the true crime case of Richard Speck. On Tuesdays, I do true crime videos, and on Saturdays, I do videos on a deeper look into crime, and those are videos that revolve either around death or crime. This video is for educational purposes, and I mean no harm to anyone that is related to this case. I would also like to say I am not an expert. I have just researched this topic and pulled information together to make this video. We do have quite a few trigger warnings for this case. We will be talking about physical abuse, SA, brief animal abuse, and also at the very end, someone unaliving themselves. If any of these topics are too much for you, I completely understand. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941 in Kirkland, Illinois. His family was very religious, and he was the seventh born out of 8 children to Benjamin and Mary Speck. His father, Benjamin, was a packer in a facility near Chicago, and his mother was a homemaker. However, unexpectedly, when Richard was about 6 years old, his father died of a heart attack. Richard was close to his father, and his death was really hard on him. About 3 years later, his mother Mary did remarry to a man named Carl, who was a traveling insurance salesman. Once his mother remarried, her and all the kids relocated to Dallas, Texas, where Carl lived. And sadly, he was both mentally and physically abusive to the kids. The family didn't have a lot of money, and they would frequently move all around different poor neighborhoods in the area. While living in Dallas, Texas, Richard fell out of a tree and suffered a really bad head injury, and we all know what head injuries can do to a developing brain. We will be getting back to the head injury later, but still at an early age, Richard started drinking, and he also started committing a lot of petty crimes. In school, Richard was an average student, but he did drop out at the age of 16. Richard's first arrest was at the age of 13 for trespassing. However, throughout the years, he got arrested many more times, usually for fraud or theft. But somehow, throughout the years and all the arrests, he managed to never have to serve any time in jail. At least, not yet. In October of 1961, Richard, at the age of 20, met his soon-to-be wife, who was only 15 at the time. They met at a Texas state fair, and him and Shirley Malone got married 3 months later and had a daughter together named Bobby Lynn. A year later, Richard was arrested for forging a coworker's paycheck, and this time he was actually sentenced jail time. He was sentenced 3 years, but somehow he only had to serve 16 months before he was released. Okay, so now he's released out on parole, but only 1 month later, he went right back to jail. And that's because he was charged with aggravated assault on a woman in her apartment complex parking lot. He had a knife on him, but he didn't use it. This time, he was only sentenced to 16 months in prison. But this man really did luck out, because this time he only had to serve 6 months before he was released. He's obviously a serial offender. I have no idea why they didn't at least make him serve his full jail time. However, he wasn't released because of good behavior. He was actually released because there was a computer error that had the wrong date typed in, and because of that, he was released early. While in prison this time, he got a forearm tattoo that was soon to be really well known. It said, "Born to Raise Hell." When his 6 months was up, he was released in January of 1966, and this time, Shirley immediately served him paperwork. She wanted a divorce, and I don't blame her. Okay, so now he's freshly out of prison. Richard is 25 years old and has been arrested 41 times and jailed twice. The year of 1966 was very eventful for Richard, and not in a good way. All these events that are based on this case all happened within the first half of 1966. So here we go. 2 months after his release, in March of 1966, Richard thought it would be a great idea to rob a grocery store. In doing so, he took 70 cartons of cigarettes and thought that he could sell them. However, he thought that the best way to sell them would be to sell them in the parking lot in front of the grocery store. Yeah. Well, I'm sure as you all could imagine, it didn't take that long for the cops to put 2 and 2 together. So they issued a warrant out for his arrest, and they were on their way to go get him. When Richard caught wind of this, he immediately jumped in his secondhand car, drove it to the bus station, ditched it, and hopped on a bus straight to Monmouth, Illinois. Monmouth is where his sister Carolyn lived, and he stayed with her and her husband while he was looking for a job. He was able to find a job, and he actually started working as a carpenter, but this didn't last very long. Less than a month after moving in with his sister, on April 2nd, Richard broke into Virgil Harris's house, who was a 65-year-old woman. Once he got in, he robbed and arred her. Luckily, she did survive, though, and she was able to call the police and tell them that she was robbed and attacked by a man who had a southern accent. Then, less than 2 weeks later, on April 13th, Richard went to a small pub in his town, and he got into a fight with the bartender, who was 32-year-old Mary Kay Pierce. He ruthlessly beat her. He hit her so hard in the stomach that it actually ruptured her liver and she died. Richard was questioned by the police for this attack and the attack on Virgil. However, after questioning, he wasn't held, probably because they didn't have enough evidence on him yet. But this was an awful idea that the police didn't hold him, because Richard wasn't waiting for them to get more information on him. He skipped town and went to stay with his other sister named Martha. Once the police were able to get more information on him, they went to arrest him in his hotel room, but he wasn't there because he left already. However, they did find evidence that was from Virgil's house. And see, I don't know why they didn't keep searching for him, but I didn't read anything where they continued to look for him. It just kind of seemed like they gave up. And I mean, like, come on, this guy is a serial offender. Anyway, so now he's living with his sister Martha, and it is still April. However, he didn't stay living with his sister for very long because Martha's husband didn't want Richard to live there. So they kicked him out and he got a hotel on Skid Row near the National Maritime Union hiring hall, like Martha's husband Gene suggested. Since Gene suggested it, he actually drove Richard over to the hiring office. That way he could get him a letter of authority to work, and on April 30th, Richard was hired. He started working as a crewman on the Clarence B. Randall freight ship, and he worked on this ship for 3 months while it traveled on Lake Michigan. They ported in different parts of Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, and while he was doing this, he actually applied for another job on a different ship that would be more of a permanent position. Unfortunately for him, though, this position went to another seaman who was more qualified. However, I don't think this guy got the other position just because he was more qualified, but also because Richard was back on the authorities' radar. And this is because he found out on July 8th that he didn't get the position. However, on July 20th, Indiana police wanted to question Richard about 3 girls that went missing. The ship was ported in Indiana at the time of the girls' disappearance. And I mean, Richard's past, it's not really a secret. People knew about it. At the same time, Michigan officials also wanted to question Richard on the disappearance of 4 females that happened while the ship was docked in Michigan. And these 4 females ranged from 7 to 60 years old. But Richard did what he did best. He fled. He wasn't giving them a chance at all to catch him. However, on July 12th, he was offered another position on an oil tanker, so, of course, he went to go take it. Richard was super excited and he made his way over to East Chicago where this tanker was located at. However, it turns out that when he got there, all the slots were already filled up. I think it was kind of like a first come, first serve kind of thing. Needless to say, he was pissed. So he made his way back down to South Chicago, where he had his hotel at near the hiring hall. After getting back to South Chicago, he decided he'd go for a couple drinks at the pub that was down the street. And this guy should not be drinking. Only bad things happen when this man drinks. And this time was no different. While drinking at the bar, he met a 53-year-old woman and they hit it off. So he invited her to come back to his hotel room for, you know. But what happened was not what she was expecting. They got to the hotel room and he stole her pew-pew that she had on her and arred her. Luckily, she did survive, but after that, apparently he just left the hotel room and wandered the streets until he fell asleep on the street. The next day, he rented a room at a hotel called the Shipyard Inn, and he got it for about a week or so while he waited for another position from the hiring hall. Since he didn't hear anything from the hiring hall yet, he decided to spend the day drinking. And yet again, nothing good happens when he drinks. At some point while drinking at the bar on this night, he got into a fight with another man and decided to pull out the pew-pew that he stole from the woman the night before. And I'm not sure if he got kicked out or left on his own, but either way, what is known is that he began heading west on East 100th Street, and this is where the main events of this case happen. On July 13th, 1966, Richard made his way to the doorstep of a townhouse where 9 nursing students lived. When he got there, he knocked on the door, and 23-year-old Corazon Amareo opened the door and he forced his way in at pew-pew point. He then corralled the 6 girls that were there and put them all into one room. He then told them to empty out their pockets and tied them up with strips of a bed sheet. He said he wasn't going to hurt them and that he just wanted their money so he could get to New Orleans. But he ended up being there for 5 hours. By midnight, the other 3 nursing students had arrived, but before they even got there, he already started bringing them one by one into a separate bedroom where he would either stab or strangle them to death. From the main room, where all the women were corralled, all they could really hear were some muffled screams and some rustling noises, so they didn't know exactly what was happening in the other room, but they knew it wasn't good. They also knew that as soon as he was done with whatever woman he took, that one of them would be next. And the women who got there later who were still working received the worst of the beatings and violence. When there was only one woman left, Gloria Davy, he kept her in the main room, where he beat and ard her before killing her. Shortly after her death, he left. However, something that Richard didn't know was that one of the women, Corazon, who opened the door, actually rolled under the bed when he wasn't looking. Corazon stayed under the bed for most of the ordeal, including when her friend was getting beat and ard on the bed that she was under. A couple of hours after he left, Corazon finally built the courage to get out from under the bed. She untied herself and made her way to the 2nd floor of the townhouse and pushed out one of the window screens. She started yelling as loud as she could for help. She said, quote, "They're all dead. My friends are all dead. Oh God, I'm the only one alive." She stayed there and continued to scream until the police arrived, and once they did, they took her into the police station for questioning. She was able to give detailed information on the man and the events that happened that night. She said that the man was about 6 feet tall, 160 pounds, had a southern accent, blonde hair, and a tattoo on his arm that said "Born to Raise Hell." She also worked with a sketch artist so that way they could come up with a drawing that they could put in the newspaper the next day. As soon as the police heard the description and saw the drawing, they instantly knew who it was that did this. And of course, it was no surprise. He was always causing disturbances in the city, and especially in that area. Now, all that was left to do for the police was to find him. I thought this would be a good time to stop and talk about each victim that was lost in this horrendous attack. So I'm going to show pictures and talk about each one and a little bit about their lives. Nina Schmally loved Elvis, cats, and the color pink. She fell in love with nursing when she volunteered at an elderly care facility. Pat Matusik had a big heart. She took care of her dying cousin Tommy when she was only 14. Her and her sister Betty Jo were very close, and after her death, Betty Jo even named one of her daughters after Pat. Pam Wilkening was said to be quiet and studious. She loved nursing so much that even when she was punched in the face by a psych patient, she didn't let it stop her. Mary Ann Jordan was funny, hardworking, and a great friend. She had 5 siblings and was especially close to her youngest brother who had Down syndrome. Susie Ferris. Susie loved cooking, clothes, and was popular. She was actually planning her wedding to Mary Ann's brother. Tina Passione was said to be a good cook and very family-oriented. She wrote letters to her family in the Philippines and many times would tell her family how much she hated the cold winters of Chicago. Merlita Gargiulo came from a large family with 8 siblings. She was shy, hardworking, loved the outdoors, and had a beautiful singing voice. And Gloria Davy. She was driven, headstrong, and creative. She was the president of the Student Nurses Association of Illinois, and her 11-year-old sister walked the stage to get Gloria's diploma. This is the stuff that makes these stories feel real. I know we probably all watch so many true crime stories that after a while it becomes desensitizing, and it makes it hard to really capture that this happened to real people. These are real stories. This is real pain these people felt, and their families had to go through losing their loved ones. This is what brings humanity back to these stories. Okay, let's take a breather and we'll come right back. Okay, back to the story. Richard Speck is now on the run and he is hiding at that hotel at the Shipyard Inn. At first, Richard didn't know that he left a witness, so he just continued life as normal. Richard went out on the fire escape and was drinking, and he actually ran into another man that was staying at the hotel as well, and they had some drinks together and were just talking. That man he was having drinks with was Cloud Lunsford, and later that day he saw the newspaper and saw the drawing of Richard, so he called the police to tell them where Richard was staying. But for some reason that I truly do not understand, the police didn't follow up with the lead. Now, this is the part where we're going to talk about someone who is attempting to unalive themselves. If you don't want to listen to this part, you could skip forward to this time and carry on with the story. After a couple of days, Richard knew that his face and forearm tattoo were circulating across the media, and that it wasn't just in his area, that it was going to be national news, and he knew that he was really running out of options. So he decided that he was going to unalive himself. On July 16th, he cut the inside of one of his elbows and his right wrist. As soon as he did it, though, he instantly regretted it and immediately got help. He was rushed to Cook County Hospital, where he was being treated by a surgical resident named Dr. Leroy Smith. When Dr. Smith saw him, he didn't recognize his face, so he just continued on like he was any other patient. He cleaned the dry blood on his arm and saw the forearm tattoo, "Born to Raise Hell." He immediately recognized it, but he couldn't let Richard know that. So, after cleaning it up, he immediately called the police. They finally got him, but they weren't able to take him to jail yet because he still needed to get a surgery to repair an artery that he severed. But this time, they weren't letting him go. At all times, there were at least a dozen officers in front of his room. Once he was stable, they transferred him to Stateville Correctional Center just outside of Chicago. When he was arrested, the police didn't really know how to question him because the Supreme Court just established Miranda rights, so they actually held him for quite a while before even questioning him. They held him for 3 weeks without questioning, which is kind of like in that gray scale of the law, but it worked because they definitely had more than enough circumstantial evidence. It took about a year for the trial to start, but on October 3rd, 1967, the trial began. As you can imagine, this case was all over the news. Richard was examined by a panel of psychiatrists who said that he was fit to stand trial, but they also said that he suffered from organic brain syndrome. And this organic brain syndrome came from when he fell out of the tree as a child. From this really hard hit to his head, they believe that this is what caused his intolerance to alcohol and his extreme fits of rage. I had to look it up because I never heard of it before, and to me it kind of sounded fake. But it's not. It's not considered a mental disorder like anxiety or depression, but it's something that is caused by physical trauma to the brain. Things that could cause this are, of course, physical trauma to the brain, continuous drug use, and even a stroke. When brain cells are damaged from this, it can cause poor judgment, confusion, memory loss, extreme rage, paranoia, and so much more. Of course, the defense used this to build their case, but it was pretty much a lost cause. Prosecution had a ton of Richard's fingerprints, as well as other circumstantial evidence, but they also had the most powerful weapon of all, Corazone's eyewitness testimony. When Corazone was on the stand, the prosecution asked her to point to the man who did this horrendous crime. So she stood up and walked right up to Richard, so close that she was almost touching his chest, and she said, "This is the man." Her testimony was detailed and well said, and the trial lasted for 12 days. The entire time, Richard said that he didn't remember anything that happened, and he also didn't show remorse the whole time. On April 15th, 1967, the jury came up with their verdict, and it only took them 45 minutes. They found him guilty on all 8 counts of murder, and he was sentenced with the death penalty. However, in 1972, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to exclude someone who opposed of the death penalty from being on the jury. Because of this, Richard's sentence was changed to 8 consecutive, not concurrent, life sentences. This means that as soon as one life sentence is done being served, the next one immediately starts, and he received anywhere from 50 to 150 years for each death sentence, meaning that he wouldn't get out of jail for 400 to 1,200 years. And this man, he asked for parole. Of course, he was denied, though. Idiot. He was caught multiple times for drugs and moonshine in his cell, and I also heard that people called him Birdman because there were 2 sparrows that flew into his cell one day, and he kept them. Sadly, though, this did not go how I thought it was going to go. We know that he was called Birdman because he had an interview with criminal profiler John Douglas from the FBI, and this is what he said. He said one day that a guard came in and told him that he can't keep the birds, so he said back, "I can't have it." Skip forward 15 seconds if you don't want to hear this, but I'm not going to get graphic. Richard basically said that if he can't have them, no one can, and he walked over to a spinning ceiling fan, and you can imagine the rest. Richard said that the guard was in absolute and complete shock, and I mean, yeah, I would be too. And in 1991, a day before Richard's 50th birthday, he died of a heart attack. just like his father. A few years after his death in 1996, a video was leaked from the prison he was staying in from 1988. This video was released by an anonymous lawyer, but it was given to a news anchor from WBBM. Apparently, the lawyer received it from another inmate that was at that prison. In this video, Richard was wearing blue silk female underwear and also appeared to have enlarged breasts. It showed them using some Coca-Cola and also showed them engaging in some acts. Behind the camera, there was another inmate who asked questions about his interest in being with men, and he said that he enjoyed it. I also found in my research that it was said that he was smuggling in female hormones to take. When it was analyzed by psychologists, they believed that he was doing this to give up his manhood so that way he could experience the same kind of degradation that he put his victims through. Based on everything I learned and read about this guy, though, I do not think that's true. He showed no remorse throughout the whole entire trial and just continued to do bad things in prison as well. And he continued to do crimes throughout his whole entire life, and he never stopped because someone got hurt. Honestly, to me, I kind of think that he had so many anger issues because he couldn't be his real self. In the beginning, we said that his family was very religious, and, being a part of the LGBTQ plus community wasn't as accepted as it is nowadays. And I think, as weird as it sounds, him being in prison, he got to experience what it was like to be his true self. But I don't know. That's just my opinion. If you guys have different ones, leave them in the comments because I'd love to hear what you guys think. Also, during this video, he was asked by another prisoner how it felt to kill all those women, and he responded, quote, "Like I always felt. Had no feelings. If you're asking me if I'm sorry, no." When this video was leaked, it caused extreme outrage, as I'm sure you all could imagine. Illinois Corrections received a ton of scrutiny, and this video was used as justification for the death penalty. So I usually like to end the video on an interesting note. So today's fun fact is that Richard actually had a lifelong fear of people staring at him. And on a more irritating note, back in 1966, after Richard was released from prison the second time, he was actually arrested on a robbery and stabbing incident and was let go on the burglary charge and was only fined $10 for the stabbing. Make that make sense. And this is just one of those aggravating cases where this man didn't have to be on the streets. He was arrested multiple times and he was supposed to be in jail much longer than he actually was. And if he did stay in jail for his full sentencing, then this wouldn't have ever happened. Well, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider liking this video or maybe even subscribing. If you have any case suggestions you would like me to cover, please leave them in the comments down below. Other than that, though, I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day. Bye! Richard. Richard. There. Was it that hard?